as I was saying, we just started recording, so let me kind of start over. I'll back up. We're gonna talk about some concepts as long as the time we have. We'll talk about white shame, white guilt, maybe even white blame. I do want to talk about call in versus call out a little bit because that's been a concept that's been pretty important to me. And the way I'm going to do that is I am going to go through some history, and it's not pleasant history. It's not, and there's no way around it. But to be, I have to say, work as an anti-racist is not comfortable. It can't be comfortable by virtue of what it is. If it's comfortable, it ain't working. So that's kind of just some thoughts. So so I'm going to go back first. Let's see. Let me share screen. Give me share screen. Boom. And I got to get the right one. I think this is the right one. It looks like it is. Yes, this is. So y'all can see the share screen okay? Give me a thumbs up. Yeah. No. Uh,
I'm seeing a map.
that's what I meant for you to see is a map. I'm
Okay.
sorry. Yeah, so the history that we're going to talk about, I don't know if you can see my mouse as well, but we're going to talk about Longview. I'm going to talk about Palestine. I'm going to talk about Waco, and then we're going to come closer to home. We're going to talk about Georgetown and Taylor and that area. So really, I'm going to go in backwards. This is one that affected me heavily when I came across this research, and I'm going to get to a little bit more of this, but this is the Slocum Massacre. Is anybody familiar with this? Anybody? Okay, and I don't want to do all the reading, so can somebody read, let's say, the first two paragraphs here? Would somebody mind reading that? If you can unmute.
I got it.
Okay,
The
thank you.
Slocum Massacre occurred on July 20th, 1910 in Slocum, Texas, an unincorporated community in southeastern Anderson County. The city used to be home to a thriving African American community with several businesses and farms owned by Black residents. Leading up to the massacre, a lynching of a Black man in nearby Cherokee County sparked racial tensions in the Slocum area. White rumors circulated that Black residents had been meeting in Slocum to plan an armed rebellion. Racial tensions only intensified when a white man reportedly sought to collect a disputed debt from a well-respected Black farmer named Abe Wilson, and when a road construction foreman put an African American in charge of soliciting aid for road improvements. A confrontation erupted, enraging Jim Spurger, a local white farmer who became the primary agitator of the conflict that led to the massacre. Many newspapers and eyewitnesses' accounts report that Spurger instigated the events by claiming that Blacks had threatened him.
Thank you, Steve. Let's see. I'm going to summarize the rest because it does get into a little bit of detail, and I don't mean it to be overly ugly, but the bottom line at the end of the day, there were an estimated anywhere from 8 is kind of a low number. This article says 22, but some estimates are up over 250 citizens of Slocum were killed. They were driven away from the community. They left the community. Their property was taken over by the white population that left them there. They did several newspaper clippings appeared. It was all over Texas when this occurred. And again, this is Slocum, Texas. It's outside of Palestine. Maybe 2 hours from here. This is the one that bothers me the most. This is an actual article from July 31st, so a couple days after the event, from a newspaper in Abilene. This was one of the ways that we were covering these types of events in Texas. And when we're talking white guilt, white shame. So as I was digging into this, reading some of these old newspapers and reading about it, that's I think when I first started to understand what white guilt and white shame meant and how it could immobilize you, because it just, I couldn't believe what I was reading. So I'm going to move a couple. Any thoughts on Slocum? Any impressions? I do have some
Well,
queries.
one thing jumped out in the subtitle there. Whites gathered arms and went coon hunting. And that's a term that was one used still when I was growing up to some degree as a derogatory term.
That's a great point, Tobin. You're exactly right, and that's and this whole headline is, and it was interesting when you read across Texas how different areas read into this event, because the rest of the story at the end of the day, Spurger and 14 others were arrested. 6 of them were charged with murder. There were no African Americans charged because it wasn't an armed rebellion. It was a hunt down is what it was. And I guess the really sad thing is so different areas reported it differently. And I think the sad thing is at the end of the day, they were down in Galveston, and all 14 never went to trial. They were all freed. So I want to move. I'm going to move to. Oh, go ahead, Steve.
I just wanted to make a brief comment. Many of these confrontations had property at the basis. It was intolerable to the white community for Negroes to be prosperous and owning property.
Fantastic point, because I think that you summarized one of the, if not the main driver for the whole lost cause and Jim Crow era that this is a part of. So I want to move to Jesse Washington, and this is right out of Wikipedia, but I cut it out because it has some of the pictures of the scenes from the area, and I just didn't want to put them up here. I didn't want to. So this is just the text, and if somebody could read maybe the first 2 paragraphs here, if you can.
Could you enlarge the font, please?
Yes, let me see if I can. Hold on. Is that a little better?
Yeah, that's a lot better.
Okay, I can make it bigger than that if need be. Let me just make it a little bigger. There we go.
I can read.
Oh, thank you.
Jesse Washington was an African-American 17-year-old farmhand who was lynched in the county seat of Waco, Texas on May 15th, 1916, in what became a well-known example of racially motivated lynching. Is there any other kind of lynching? Washington was convicted of raping and murdering Lucy Fryer, the wife of his white employer in rural Robinson, Texas. He was chained by his neck and dragged out of the county court by observers. He was then paraded through the street, all while being stabbed and beaten before being held down and castrated. He was then lynched in front of Waco's City Hall. Over 10,000 spectators, including city officials and police, gathered to watch the attack. There was a celebratory atmosphere among whites at the spectacle of the murder, and many children attended during their lunch hour. Members of the mob cut off his fingers and hung him over a bonfire after saturating with coal oil. He was repeatedly lowered and raised over the fire for about 2 hours. After the fire was extinguished, his charred torso was dragged through the town. A professional photographer took pictures as the event unfolded.
And I'm sorry, I didn't mean to get it into that detail of what went on, but again, this is right off of Wikipedia. Thank you for reading that, Melissa. I know that's tough to read. Let me just finish and summarize. In 1916, Waco, Texas was an area they were trying to grow as a a tourist town, basically. They had a lot of attraction there. They wanted to bring people there. Jesse Washington was a young man by some accounts. He may have been, mentally retarded or mentally limited. Not sure about that. Later on, there's pretty much agreement that he probably did do the crime, but so he was tried elsewhere. Again, I believe it was in Galveston, and when they returned him to Waco, and he was sentenced, I believe, as I recall, to death, but they lynched him publicly in front of 10 to 15,000 people in Waco, Texas. It was covered across the United States. You can get articles from Alaska to Maine to Florida that covered this whole event. In the Waco paper, it stopped once he was convicted. They never covered any other event in Waco. So again, keep in mind any thoughts on that. And I don't want to go into the detail. That's not, but I think part of what I'm trying to do by going through this is give you some sense of white guilt and white shame. These are horrific events that occurred, and they impact us when we read about them, see them, become knowledgeable about them. So I'm going to move on to one more. Remember 1916, though. Whoops, I didn't mean to go that far. Whoops, where'd I go? Yeah, here it is. So I'll just talk through this one. This is Longview. Longview occurred again, going back to the map. Here's Longview. Here's Waco. Here's Palestine. So it's a little triangle. Here's us down here. So Longview's up here, and I guess that's the Piney Woods, we call it up there if we're from Texas. And let me get back here. So, this one, fortunately there weren't that many fatalities. But it's like Steve said, this similar to so many of them, Wilmington, so many of them, it was a retaliation for feeling threatened by a increasingly prosperous African American community. That's inevitably what they were caused by. So this brought us up to 1919, which then led into the Red Summer, which there were a number of what are often classified as race riots, but were really massacres. So I'm going to stop there for just a moment. Let me see if I can get this down where I can do something to it. Why is that doing that? There we go. There, sorry about that. Now I thought I could see. How do I hide that thing so I can change pages?
I think you have to stop sharing, then share that page.
All right, let me do
about.
that. Let me try it that way. Let's see if I can switch over. Oh, what happened to my thing here? I seem to have lost my page. Did I close it?
Oh, you seem to have opened up. You're on your Zoom. You want to minimize that browser part, and then just minimize that. I don't know whether you're doing it because it's.
Well, what I'm trying
maybe
to
not.
Yeah, hold on, Liz.
Yeah, seeing Terry's, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, what I'm trying to get to is
Well, he
a
hasn't
page.
shared yet, it doesn't look like. Because it should appear in that window.
Yeah.
All right, well, let me move
It's all
along.
confused, yeah. It
I'm
does
sorry.
appear in
I'm
that.
sorry, Liz. If you can
Huh?
hold on just one second.
Can you mute Liz? Thank you.
There we go. Let me go ahead and move on. I seem to have closed the browser that I had that had some of the things I wanted to show, but let me just kind of verbally go through it. So what I just showed you is a period of time from 1910 to 1920 that occurred in Texas. We could continue on because if you look just at lynchings that occur, there's 8 of them that occurred that are documented right here in Williamson County. Caldwell, Washington occurred in 1934, right? I think he was in Taylor. And so we have a pretty good history. I got involved when I first moved to Texas. My wife and I moved here in 2017, and we went over to the Georgetown Square to participate in a rally at that point in time that dealt with it dealt with a special counsel and what was happening at that time. So we showed up. We were over at the Williamson County seat, and that's when I first saw the statue that stands in front of Williamson County. And I had pictures of it, and I've closed it, unfortunately, but it's a 21-foot statue that stands right in front of the House of Justice, the courthouse in Williamson County. And it's dedicated to no particular person, just to a Confederate soldier, generic Confederate soldier. The interesting thing is McNeil Marble Works in Marietta, Georgia, who's produced it, and they produce these for both Union and Confederate soldiers. So the likeness is the same on all of it. I became aware of that statue in 2017 and got a little bit involved with this and that. I think the thing that at the time inflamed me the most was this. I saw that Williamson County actually put up a balancing memorial, if you know what that means. In other words, I've got this Confederate statue. Let me put one up over here that celebrates something about Black history, or an African American statue to balance the fact that I have this one. So Georgetown did put one up, and it's Dan Moody, who was a former governor of Texas. Y'all who are Texas residents probably know who I'm talking about. And he was put up because he had the first conviction of a Ku Klux Klan group for committing a crime, in one of the first ones in Texas. And in that period of time, which was in the 20s, the Ku Klux Klan was very powerful. I think the interesting thing about that balancing statue on Dan Moody being a hero for getting a conviction on Ku Klux Klan is the conviction was for a group of Klansmen who, tarred and feathered, didn't murder a white man. It's just amazing. And it stands right on the corner of Williamson County. So the bottom line is that's how I got involved in Williamson County, was seeing it in 2017. And when the statue went up, it was just after Jesse Washington was lynched in Waco. It was dedicated by J.P. Buchanan, who was a senator in Texas, on November 10th, 1916. And it's pretty amazing. J.P. Buchanan gave a 90-minute speech. And of that speech, approximately 10 minutes is all he talked about the Confederate soldier. The rest he talked about the South's right to succeed. Northern aggression was in there. He spent more time talking about praising the Southern women because of the UDC, the United Daughters of Confederacy, than he did the Confederate soldier. So it's pretty amazing. And I've actually transcribed his whole speech. I've got a copy of that entire speech, and it's a amazing read. He does give away in that speech the fact that the Northerners they violated the Constitution by not allowing Southerners to bring their property across northern states, and their property meaning their slaves. So it's a pretty amazing speech. I'm going to stop there for a minute and see if I can recover the queries that I have. And do y'all have any thoughts? This is pretty heavy duty stuff, but any thoughts? How does it make you feel? I mean, what does it seem like?
If I first started to dig in the way you did a good number of years ago, just reading about the presidential election of 1876, which was one of the most crooked deals in American politics and led to the end of Reconstruction. And bottom line is it was a messy election. The Electoral College was tied. They had 20 or 30 votes in the House of Representatives and couldn't choose a president. And was it Rutherford B. Hayes? I always get it confused. But anyhow, the guy who, yes, Hayes ultimately let it be known that if they would elect him, who did not win the popular vote, he would withdraw the Union troops from the remaining southern states and therefore end Reconstruction. And Reconstruction had ended in a number of the states already when the troops were withdrawn, so they knew exactly what that meant and what would happen. It meant massacres, removal of civil rights, Jim Crow laws, stripping of property, et cetera, but in order to be elected, that was a perfectly legitimate price for a American president. From there, you learn all kinds of things, and one of which was that when the troops were being removed from, I think it was Louisiana was one of the two states that still had troops, they put them in boxcars and drove them 1,000 miles to the site of a major strike that was going on in steel mills in Western Maryland, and those troops took their machine guns out and used them on the striking laborers. So there's an awful lot about American history that is pretty hideous.
Great point.
I wanted to point out that, I mean, this is really, really important stuff for us to center, when we discuss this sort of thing. But I'd also like to talk about the fact that I think two things are going on, and I can't speak because I'm not from the South, but when I look at this, because it's so horrific, some of this stuff, it gives me some emotional distance because, I would never do that, right? So I get this, it gives me some kind of emotional distance. It's hard to describe. So, but as someone from the North, for instance, it gives me some further distance, right? That I can say, well, that's not where I grew up, et cetera, et cetera. However, I think we have to look at who we are historically. And also, at least in my sense, in my case, I think I forgot and sort of knew all along about, even though I grew up in a part of the country where there literally were no people of color for hundreds of miles. There just weren't, and still aren't. Well, I think there's some more immigration from Central America now to some of the towns, but I forget that there was a very virulent but theoretical racism. I mean, if you would just hear people talk, and someday, if I'm ever sharing a screen, I'll show you, because the Ku Klux Klan was almost stamped out in the, under the Grant administration, and then had more of a resurgence in the teens and 20s of this century. And part of that was fueled by anti-immigrant sentiment, not just, the traditional racism against Black people. And I found a picture from 1920 of a hill known as the Mound outside of the town where I grew up, and it's a Easter sunrise service. This is in Northwest Iowa, and an Easter sunrise service on the Mound, which we could see from the house I grew up in. It was very prominent, beautiful view. And there's this Easter sunrise service, and they're reenacting, I guess. There's a huge cross and this big guy in white robes who's supposed to be Jesus, and some women in flapper, outfits who are the women at the tomb. And then just kind of almost barely indistinguishable, you don't notice them at first, kind of just coming out of the pearly white dawn sky, it is surrounded by men in Klansman robes. Okay, and this is 1920 in a part of the country where there never were any any people of color. So it's like you can't get away from this, you know. And and I think for people like me, I have to remember I was in a little bit of denial for a lot of my life, you know, about where I came from, you know, and what, even though it wasn't here, you know, what went on. So I really appreciate this, because it really does kind of obligate us to, you know, pay attention to this and then think, well, how is this whole country, you know, involved in that?
I would like to tell my own hometown story of Austin, Minnesota. Also, like Howard's, completely white. It's the home of the Hormel Meatpacking Company, the maker of Spam. Big presence in town. And I remember when I was a kid, my brother used to go out to the office and bang on the president's door and say, "Why are there no black people in you? Why don't you have any black people in your workers?" And they'd say, "Well, nobody applies." The usual response. So a few years ago, I learned about sundown towns, and I found this website that you could go to discover whether your town was a sundown town. And so I looked up Austin, Minnesota, and sure enough, in the 20s, there was a family of black people living in Austin, and the workers at the plant were so afraid that they were going to apply for work at the plant, which they had not done, that they went down to the shack near the railroad station where they lived, and they beat them up and made them leave town. And that was the last time there were any black people in Austin, Minnesota. So I just to underline that this is all over the country. We Northerners, who for many years felt so righteous, have no reason to do so.
Can I just throw in, you know, historically we think of the North or of average people even in the North as being anti-slavery in the pre and during the Civil War, but they weren't just anti-slavery; they were also anti-slave. You know. I mean, they didn't. You know, it was that they were threatened by the labor of slaves, and therefore they were threatened by the people who were doing this labor. So that's a big component in excluding black people from your community.
I wanted to say that I grew up in Michigan, and my ancestors ended up coming, well, some of them ended up coming to Texas. And my dad wrote a history of this man. And so I just grabbed it to see what there might be in there. He was lynched. But I also, and I wanted to see if he's white. I wanted to see if he had had a crowd of people. But there's no evidence of that. But there was an article that I just quickly glanced at that said that many Northerners who were anti-slavery that came down, they were lynched along with the blacks. So, and then I also wanted to say is that where I grew up in Michigan, when they arrived, my ancestors were the first people, the Native Americans were there. And they had really good relations at first. And then I remember reading at one point that Chief Bobbies cried when he was sent away with everybody, all the other Native Americans. But they had had good relations before that, as far as I can tell.
Go ahead, Liz.
I grew up in the New York City area, and I had 3 different experiences in some ways. I grew up in the Bronx until I was 9 years old, and I had a lot of contact with African Americans, even though the community I lived in had absolutely no African Americans. The apartment houses had very few very few even non-Jews in them. So I grew up in a Jewish community. And my experience in third grade was that a Korean child came. It was after the Korean War, and a Korean child joined my class, and no one else would talk to her except me, which was really kind of a strange experience. But I had some real experience because my grandmother ran a school with African Americans. But then we moved to Englewood, New Jersey, and there we were the only Jewish family in the community, and there was one Catholic family. So it's just really interesting to me. I mean, that doesn't have to do with race, but there were really problems for my parents more than for my brother and I. And then when we moved to Englewood, New Jersey, the situation was, I'm a child who the schools were, the Supreme Court decision was in 1954, and I was in, in 1954 I was. Um, 7 years old or something. Yeah, 7 years old. So integration followed me. But in Englewood, New Jersey, which considered itself an incredibly liberal city, they had put all the African American people in one quarter of the city. They have 4 quarters of the city, and the African American people all lived in 1 quarter of the city. Now that didn't happen because they wanted to. That happened because they weren't able to get houses in other places, and that was obviously not the part of the city that we moved into. But the class and caste, I mean, that the new book Caste has really been interesting for me. Class and caste had a lot to do with who did what in that city. And I went to a high school that was 40% African American and 60% white, which is a real different experience than a lot of people had. But it was not what I would call integrated, socially integrated in any way, although we went to the same dances and the same kinds of things, and some of us were involved in mixed groups of clubs and things like that. But it's very interesting to come from that background and recognize. But the one thing I have to say is that I knew a lot of African Americans, and I knew a lot of people. I worked with SNCC and in my high school years, and in the North. But there was never any discussion of the kind of lynchings that we're talking about here. That there was never any discussion about the kind of violence that actually African Americans were exposed to in that way. It certainly wasn't part of the American history courses I took.
All right.
I grew up in Texas, born and raised. I was in West Texas, not East Texas, which is definitely deep South. But we got none of this in school. I don't think I'd ever heard of any of these massacres and so forth until I was an adult. The very few Black people who lived in the small town I did start coming to public schools with all of us. And that was okay as best I could tell as a student. But we never heard any of this. And of course, we took Texas history as well as US history.
Well, that's all very pertinent stuff, good stuff, and a couple thoughts there from things that you said that I think are important too. Let me see if I got a few of my quotes up. Let me see if I can redo this and not mess it up this time. Share screen. Boom. Not that one. Let's see. I think it's that one. Yes. So a couple things. First off, get back to the statue. First off, number one, it became pretty important to me to try to do something about getting it down. And I write several letters a month to the Williamson County Commissioners Court, to all five of them. I just started doing it all at once, and met several people out there who were also very actively involved in trying to see its removal. And about that time, there was in the group that was trying to get the statue removed. And again, the discussion, I've said all along, I am opposed to any violent removal, any vandalism of the statue. Let's move it. And whether that's to a warehouse somewhere, whether we decide to destroy it, which is possibly the best thing to do, or whether we move it to the Oddfellows Cemetery where there's 100 Confederate soldiers buried in Georgetown. It really didn't matter, but there ended up being a fracture in that group, and it became over the ability to call in or call out each other. There were some things that in my estimation, and initially, to be honest, I didn't say anything, where somebody said some things that were they were not racist, but yet they were along the same lines. They had that same element of hate. They were mostly focused. There was a discussion of relationships across gender, and we ended up over that fracturing the group because I want to get into talking about a little bit about white shame, white guilt, because on that event too, for me, it became, goodness gracious, if we can't get our act straight at this point, trying to break down this white supremacy culture, it was very disheartening to me. But we can't get over. The work continues. So let's see. Can somebody, so this became an important quote to me. If someone could read the MLK quote, if you can see it and read it, I must confess.
I can read it.
Thank you.
I must confess that over the past few years, I have been gravely disappointed with the white moderate. I have almost reached the regrettable conclusion that the Negro's great stumbling block in his stride toward freedom is not the white citizen's counselor or the Ku Klux Klanner, but the white moderate who is more devoted to order than to justice, who prefers a negative peace, which is the absence of tension, to positive peace, which is the presence of justice.
I want to stop there and let anybody who wants to say this one just so much resonates with me. If we're gonna live a comfortable life, then we're not going to move forward in this effort. So, I mean, any other thoughts on this very important Martin Luther King Jr. quote?
Well, as George Fox taught us, confrontation is okay.
It speaks to me, and I've seen the results of it actually in meeting many years ago. So it's really important to speak up for me, so that doesn't get repeated.
Yeah, so let's see if I can do this better this time. If I can sort out how to, oh, I see. Oh, I can move that. Boy, that makes it so much better. Let's see. So I wanted to go, here's some queries. Let me put these up. These are just some queries. We kind of went past the first two, but let me just read the first one and maybe we can talk about the first two together. Did you already know about these events? So I'm talking about Slocum, Jesse Washington, and then Longview. If you did, where did you learn them? Should they be part of the school curriculum? Does that help or does that hurt? What's the right thing to do? And then the second we've talked a little bit about already, how does hearing about these events make you feel? How do you think these events make African Americans feel?
Hearing about these events make me feel very sick, physically ill. It's very hard to hear them. Um, it makes me feel hopeless. I am hoping that the more I learn and the more I think about this, that hopelessness will change to determination. And I am constantly amazed at, I mean, I can't imagine how African Americans feel. I mean, I assume they feel rage, impotence, disgust, hopelessness, but the extent of that, I can't begin to imagine. One of the exercises I was to do this week during the 30-day challenge was just to imagine myself as a white person standing at a counter with a whole bunch of African Americans with an African American clerk, and all of the African Americans got waited on before I did. How would I feel? Well, I would feel enraged, and just feeling that for a couple of minutes and realizing that that's daily life for African Americans is, well, I'll shut up now. It's enraging.
No, that rage is good rage. What day are you on your 30 day? Just so I know.
23.
You're ahead of me then.
Okay.
That's
It's
very
good. We can talk about it at the end.
Yes. So any other thoughts on any of these, and we'll move on?
Yeah, I think your last question is the one that I have want to talk about. The hard part is when I notice a racist thing happening. How do I address it? I felt fairly strongly about. We had a guest come and present to us about getting along with each other a couple of weeks ago at the forum, right? And she showed a series of slides, PowerPoint, and it made me very uncomfortable that those slides were almost all of white people. And that was the thing that came out of it for me. Although she had some pretty good suggestions about how we could approach people, but the few slides of African Americans were Obama, a good dependable person or whatever. And then an African American man being the disgusting person. And I have struggled with this. I know her from the past, the presenter. I feel like I need to get in touch with her, and for her own sake, but particularly because I'm a white person who noticed this, and she obviously isn't noticing it. I haven't been able to do that. I asked James for her email, and he asked her whether it was okay for him to give me her email. And I think I'm asking for some clearness from this group. He has not been back to me. I guess I need to get back to him again to see if he's heard. He may just have not heard, but I'm assuming that she wasn't comfortable with his giving me her email. I have another source of her email. And I feel prepared to do a difficult thing, which is to question how it is that she hasn't noticed this. But I am concerned about her also because at some point, if she's doing these presentations, somebody is going to get upset with the presentation. So I'm sharing this with you guys because it's been on my mind the 3 weeks since that presentation or what happened. Yeah, and I guess I need some instructions about how to call her in. I mean, I think that that would be the appropriate thing to do, to raise this with her, and to call her in. So I'll let you talk, Chip. I've sort of.
No, that's great. That's a great lead into this. I wasn't going to go here, but I think as anti-racist, I think that one of the skills that we have to develop, there's two of them that are associated with each other. One is our ability to call in others, and the other is our ability to accept being called in by others. And I mean, to me, this is a simple concept. I may be oversimplifying it, but to me, calling in is always an act of love. It comes from love. If you call someone in, you're calling them into this is how you can improve. This is, this is hurtful. This might be hurtful, as opposed to calling out. And that would be, heaven forbid we call people racist, because the whole point of all of this is to recognize that we're in a white supremacy culture. We're all racist because of how things are. So we can't call people out for that. But calling in, and Liz, I think what you said, I think it's wonderful. I think it's wonderful to try to do that. And I'll give you another example. My best friend right now is a retired law enforcement officer who works for the police union in the state of Texas. He has attended Trump rallies. He has pictures of himself, and we've gotten to the point where we can call each other in, believe it or not. So you've got to be able to do that and keep it as not attacking. So I'm going to stop there. But I think this whole thing of calling in, and I've seen it happen at our meeting. I've seen someone get called in. It was done in love, and I just think it's wonderful to see. It's it being able to accept somebody saying, when you say equality, you're missing out on the concept of equity. And it's like, but equality, spices, it's all Quakerism, it's all good stuff. But equity is really kind of more to the point. But I'm gonna keep moving. And again, anybody jump
I'd
in.
like to help Liz out here if I could.
Yes.
Liz, is this the woman who we saw the presentation on, I can't remember what it was called 3 weeks ago. What was it called? Yeah, well, she has a website that you can send things to her on her website. But at any rate, I think all you want to say is I enjoyed your presentation. I have some suggestions for making it more equitable and more interesting to people with a variety of backgrounds.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah.
That way it's a lot easier for her to accept and a lot less hard for you to share with her.
Yeah. I will try that. I will try that. It's uncomfortable for me to not have her permission to have her email. But if she has a website, I'll look that up, and that does give me permission to be in touch with her.
Liz, it might be worth asking if anybody else noticed, and I already told you that I didn't notice because I was listening but not looking at the screen sharing that she was doing, so I didn't see the pictures. I just heard the presentation verbally. But if anybody else noticed, then it could be you and somebody else, or it could be the Peace and Social Concerns Committee or whatever. It wouldn't have to be just you all by yourself.
I don't know. Did anybody else notice?
I came at toward the end, so I don't think I saw it, what you saw.
But I think I didn't notice it either, Liz. I believe I was at the same one, but I think that if it impressed you that way, that I think Steve's thought is a pretty good one. I think that if you're calling in, I think that I think that you should feel good and comfortable about it, especially the way Steve said. You can open yourself if you have questions about it, contact me.
Yeah, I think I will do that. Thanks. I really appreciate it. But that's the way, I mean, I think noticing is the main job that I feel I need to do at this point, and calling in when, as you say, calling in when I do notice it, not just letting it go by. So.
Yeah, let's stay on that query a little bit, because that's a good query of what can be done. What should we be doing as anti-racists?
I think as far as teaching children, we need to get the same response that we have about the Holocaust. Yes, it's awful, but that doesn't mean you don't teach them about it. You teach them about it so it doesn't happen again. Whereas I think in my school, they taught me the achievements of people here, the things everybody would aspire to, and ignored and deliberately skipped the things that people were ashamed of or blamed for.
Yeah, let me add another one. I think that one of the great sins, as it were, of slavery through Reconstruction, through Jim Crow, up right through presence, is taking the voice away from minorities, let alone just African Americans. So I think listening, in my mind, ranks right up there as something that's important. Making a real effort to give back a voice.
Maybe this is going a little too far afield from what we're wanting to focus on here, but I think it's important to remember, and you can see this all the way from people like W.B. Du Bois and MLK and Malcolm X on forward, is that economic justice is racial justice. And we have to remember that, because I think there's always been a tendency, as we can see from MLK's comments, but also in our own day, we have our own version of it, an attempt to cloak equity in terms of just changing people's bad attitudes and behavior without getting at some of the underlying factors that contribute to this, both in terms of economic justice and equity, and in terms of economic resentment on the part of white people as well. And I think, and also sometimes I think the concept of equity gets twisted around to where, well, we can have exactly the same society we have now, but if we just have racially proportionate participants in all aspects of our society, then we'll be okay. Let's have the right percentage of white people killed by cops and black people killed by cops, or let's have the right percentage of troops in Afghanistan, racially distributed, et cetera, and then we'll be okay. And I think we have to remember, push back on that, and to look for other kinds of equity and equality in society that really will address the underlying factors.
This is a really small thing, but I have a stock account, and I have an appointment with my stockbroker to talk about Black businesses that I can put my money in, and because I'm sure my stock account is heavily weighted toward, if not entirely, white-owned businesses.
You're gonna have a hard time with that one, Melissa.
Well, I've looked online and I've found some things to invest in, but we'll see.
But I think that's a fundamental point that we have to recognize in terms of what we mentioned earlier, what Chip mentioned earlier, that this will not be comfortable. If we wanted to really achieve racial justice and equity, it's a fundamental restructuring of our entire capitalist society. Will not be comfortable at all. And a really hard road to hoe, because everything that our country has built up to over the 250 years is embedded in the political economic system, and it's there to support and maintain and grow white privilege. Every aspect of it.
Well said, because that is certainly true, and it's not comfortable, and one thing. Let me just go back real quick. One thing to the statue. I became grateful in a lot of ways for Miss Katie Daffin, who was the president of the UDC back in the 1916 era, who raised the money to erect the statue that stands before the House of Justice in Georgetown, Texas. I became a little grateful for that statue to be there, because what it now represents is something that we can make a positive step as a community, hopefully in a somewhat united manner, of a statement that no, we don't stand for that anymore. We understand what that statue really is. So I'm gonna kind of stop there. Let's see. I did put this up. Actually, Steve, I'm not sure if this is the one you gave last time we were talking about this, but yeah, the concept of equity has come up a couple times. And Melissa, I think what you're doing is absolutely wonderful. It's been on my list. The next time I talk to my broker as well, to tell him I expect him to be able to provide me something that I can move towards Black-owned businesses. Not everything, but just, make it equitable, make a conscious effort to do that. And so I do applaud that. Let's see, I had a couple other things maybe to hit. I don't want to go on. Let's see. We talked about that one. I had to re-scramble. We've talked about calling in versus calling out. There was this one, white guilt. Let's see, who mentioned, Mary, was it you that talked about the Holocaust? Yes. Yeah, so I mean, the whole concept of white guilt is not a new one. I mean, it was in fact built around, or it did come up post World War II Germany. And there were actually some discussions, down here at the bottom of reparations basically to Israel from Germany. And that's not really where I wanted to go as much with this, as much as really to say I look at three different terms meaning three different things. And I think for me, I look at white guilt as it's an enabler. It can be an enabler. It can activate you to do things. It's tension. But it's not turned inward like white shame would be turned inward. I mean, white guilt would say this was a bad act. Slavery, putting up this statue, these lynchings, they are bad acts. But white shame would be I'm a bad person because I'm white and white people did these acts. That's destructive as opposed to constructive. So again, it's another thing I think that you can, use calling in, and say, listen, you're going a little bit too far here. You don't need to go that far. It's not about you. It's about the racism, and along those lines, it's white blame is the third concept. And when we go out, and I haven't been out for several weeks now, I did go out about 3 or 4 weeks ago to the statue to collect signatures with my friend Jason Northcutt, who's actually running for a county seat I'm sorry, a city council in Georgetown. And I hadn't seen him in a while. And I sat down with him, and as we were sitting there, an individual who I know by name came up, who's the colonel of the Sons of Confederate Veterans in Williamson County, the Williamson County Grays. And he had only one comment to say, me and Jason, and he said, "How you boys doing today?" And Jason is African American. And I just boiled. I didn't say anything, but it so irritated me. But saying every time that we're out there, inevitably the Sons of Confederacy are out there with their flags and whatnot. And I have to constantly remind myself that I'm out here not because of them. I'm out here because of racism. They are not the enemy. They have that of God within them too. They are not the enemy. The enemy is racism, and that's become a pretty important concept to me, that it's not the people that I'm out there protesting. It's not the people that I think I may have told y'all before. I have a friend named Ray who lives in Tennessee, and we had a long conversation about this. And we're professional friends, but we were a little bit more than that. So anyway, he told me, he said, "Yes, I fly the Northern Virginia battle flag in my garage, in my workshop. It stays there." And this was after he had told me about all the African American friends that he had. And I said, "Well, what would happen if one of your African American friends came over and your flag was there?" He said, "Well, I would take it down if they came over." And so I say that really just to say it's a matter of recognition. And I can't say to Ray, "Well, don't you understand what you just said to me?" And because we're not at a point where I can call him in. Anything
Can I
I
ask you
say
a question?
Yes.
When the man from the sons or grandsons or whatever of the Confederacy said, "How are you boys doing today?" did he say it in a way that was friendly? And did you talk with the African American person afterwards about the word boy, or did your blood just boil because you assumed that the son of the Confederacy was implying that you both were less than by saying, "How are you boys doing today?"
That's a great question, Joanna. So I think for me, I grew up in Virginia and then worked in North Carolina and South Carolina. I've seen a lot of Confederate statues, and we got Virginia history every other year in grade school. We didn't learn about these kinds of things, but I think being in South Carolina, especially, I had several people that worked for me that were African American, and I had conversations with them, and I think, and they made it very clear that this particular individual that's being called boy, or even if it was in a group, if we said, "Hey boys, let's go," and there was two white people and he was there, Al Taylor was there, he said, it's just too much for me to handle. I can't deal with that. So to answer your question, when Colonel Little said, "How you boys doing today?" I think I reacted to that history. When I said to Jason, I said, "How did that make you feel?" Because I did ask him, "How did that make you feel?" He kind of shrugged and said, "I'm used to it. I'm used to it." And I mean, it didn't bother him near as much as it bothered me. So it's a good question. Let's see.
If I can ask another question about that.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I realized the colonel was just solo in this interaction, right? There were
Yes.
two of you and one of him. What would be some other ways that he could have said what he said without using the word boy? And like assuming that he just wanted to say, "How are you all doing today?" I guess I just said one of them, but what, um, and what did you say when he said that, and what might you have said that might have shown some light on the concern that you immediately had?
Well, those are good questions too, Joanna. So first off, I think most important to say is that what I said about it's racism, we're out here for not people who are racist. So I
Mhm.
think I think for me, I probably let myself get enraged. Well, first off, this individual knows Jason by name.
Mhm.
They've met.
Mhm.
So I would have felt a lot more better if he would have said, "Hey, Jason, how are you?"
Mhm.
instead of what he said,
I see.
and that's and all of that is was really to say, I think what you're driving at, or it's an important point. I got angry about that, and I think I let myself get into that point where I was blaming, this is all a problem because of this racist that's standing in front of me. And that's not what it's about. It's about racism. Should have probably said, Shelby, I'm doing fine. How are you today? And then we could have had a conversation. And I have found one other time we were out collecting signatures, and believe it or not, we had Trump supporters out there, and I actually got a Trump supporter to sign the petition to remove the statue. So it is
Hmm.
amazing when you talk to people what can happen.
Mhm.
I think it's 2:41. There really wasn't. Let me see if there was. We did that. We did that. We talked about that, and we talked about that. So just back to queries again. Are there any that maybe we can start to wrap up if that's all right with y'all? If there are there any of these more to discuss?
I'd like to pick up on Mary's point about education, uh, especially in the elementary schools and places like Texas, where there is a substantial amount of, quote, local history taught. Local history taught. I think we should be pushing our local school districts to include modules every year that they're teaching local history, Texas history, about some of these things. For instance, the cause of the Texas Revolution against Mexico was very much based on Santa Anna starting to enforce the anti-slavery laws that Mexico had. There are a lot of things that, if they were presented along the way, might help develop a generation of young Texans and young Americans who have a less supremacist point of view. White supremacist, American supremacy, capitalist supremacy, etc., have to be dealt with early on.
You go ahead, Melissa.
Just to pick up on that, Steve, that's one of the things that Leonard Moore, the UT professor who gave a number of lectures on African American history, he suggested that all of us white people, especially those of us with children, go to the public schools and get them to create full year classes in African American history, not just Black History Month, but a full year of classes is in the same way that we have a full year of basically white history. I thought that was a great idea.
Well, I'm going to say that as a former elementary school art teacher in AISD, that history is taught as part of social studies, and social studies does not have a STAR test. There is no statewide test in social studies. Therefore, there is very little taught in the way of social studies, period, at all, because it's not a tested subject.
You're not suggesting that we get them to test in that area, I hope.
Well, I don't know, Melissa. I really don't know. I mean, knowing what I know about the time pressures that public school teachers experience, especially in 3rd, 4th, and 5th grade, because of the STAR test, that I can't imagine the public schools themselves creating such a curriculum that, as Leonard Moore suggested, I can only imagine that if such a curriculum was created and then provided free of charge, easy greasy, I'm telling you, you know.
Well, but we also know, I think, that testing itself was created as a way of keeping people of color out of educational institutions. So perhaps what we need to do is attack the test itself.
Well, I'm sure that a lot of people would agree with you on that.
And I think a lot of teachers would agree with that too, right?
Mhm.
I mean, they're just having to teach to the test.
Yeah.
I would like to suggest that one of the things that you had up on the screen was a picture of Loretta J. Ross at Smith College. She has some wonderful things that I think you can access on YouTube about the concept of calling in and calling out. And I think it would be, I'm gonna look them up, and I've heard her once on the subject, and because it's kind of a new thing for me, I just think it would be a good thing for all of us to look into so that we become more familiar with that and how to go about doing it.
I think that's a great idea, because if the ability within a community to call each other in, I'm not sure there's a higher measure of love, the ability to call someone in and receive it. I think it's pretty important to be able to do that. Well, we hit a lot of different things. That was sure enjoyable. I enjoyed it. I kind of lost my internet thing there for a while, but I think I recovered that pretty well. I was able to do that, but I think ultimately, kind of the end of the day where I came, and I tend to sometimes think a little globally. Let me take this off. I think sometimes a little globally, but I guess I've come to the place where I believe that one of the most important next steps that we can take as a human race is to understand and eliminate that which resulted in racism. And we've got to figure out how to do that. And the thing about it is, we can't say we're going to eliminate racist, because then we just took a step in the wrong direction, because we missed the whole point, where we've got to eliminate racism. And it is a part of each and every one of us. And I'll give you an example. I was driving to Georgetown I think it was a Saturday morning. This was early on, and I was getting out a little bit more, and I saw an individual on the side of the road. I was on 35 driving from Cedar Park over to Georgetown. I saw an individual on the side of the road, and I was in the left lane. I couldn't pull over. He was walking the same direction I was going, and I'm thinking, goodness gracious, that individual's in trouble and everything. He may be homeless, and he was African American. And as I'm driving down the road, I couldn't pull over, because I was going to see if I could pull over and give him a hand. And when I drove down a little ways, there's a nice Alfa Romeo sitting in the side that he had run out of gas. And I realized, even just making the assumption that this individual was homeless or in trouble and they were Black, and I'm not sure they were related, I realized, it takes work. It takes work every day. So, anybody want to add any other kind of closing things?
Thank you.
Oh, thank you. I do have a question, Joanna. Have we heard anything? Can I ask, have we heard anything from the prisons as far as how people are doing on death row specifically?
Regarding what?
The weather, the cold.
I haven't heard anything from anybody that I know personally. Maybe Glenna has?
Oh, yeah. I have, I talked with Delia yesterday, and there's this article by the Marshall Project on the conditions in Texas prisons, and it's horrible. They've lost power and water. The commodes aren't working. They went into some, and some of the inmates had, now it wasn't all Polunsky, which is where we go. It was all of Texas. But some of the prisoners sent the Marshall Project pictures of their breakfast, and it's awful. It's I asked Delia a few months ago how her brother was, and he had a massive heart attack, death row, and she said he isn't going to make it. And she did tell me that Friday there was a work crew working on a water main at Polunsky, and so hopefully there will be water. It's, you know, you feel like you have to do something, but you don't know really what it is. Anyway, she said, I just, you know, I try to have a happy life and not think about it because there's not anything I can do. But she is connected with other family members of prisoners. So anyway, I think it's probably beginning to get better, but it sounds like it's been really awful and like being in a concentration camp. Before the pandemic, generally they were getting their mail. I mean, there's always some things that fall through the cracks, so you never can say everyone got their mail. But that's about it. I'm sorry.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for
Thank
sharing
you for
that.
thanking me. Yeah.
Well, it's very hard to hear. Why don't we hold the situation for those that we know that are within the prison walls? Why don't we hold them in the light while we perhaps close with a few minutes of worship? Thank you, friends. Liz, I didn't know you were from Englewood. My family is actually from Englewood. I lived there until I was about 2 years old, I think.
Oh, you're kidding. Oh my
No,
goodness.
no, my grandfather was the Onderdonks. There's actually an Onderdonk house in New York, but they were a pretty predominant family in Englewood at the
Well,
time.
Englewood has four quadrants, and there's the African American, the fourth ward. I lived in the third ward, which was largely uh, Italian and Irish Catholic. And then when I left for college, my parents moved to the second ward, which was getting somewhere up the hill. But then there was the first ward was the hill and with Dwight Morrow. I mean, there was a great diversity of economic economics and with Dwight Morrow and the Lindberghs, and those people all lived up there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Both my parents went to Dwight Morrow, and my dad lived on Slocum Avenue. My mom lived on Tenafly, right
Oh,
there.
she lived on Tenafly Avenue. Well, we lived off of Tenafly Avenue on every place for a long time, and then we moved over to right by the hospital. Take it easy, Howard.
See, Howard.
Yeah, right by the hospital. A house right by the hospital, which was the other side of the tracks.
Yes.
So, you have the other side of the tracks, but I grew up in an apartment in first a 1-bedroom apartment and then a 3-bedroom apartment or 2-bedroom apartment in the Bronx. So
Yeah.
so that was way up as far as my parents were concerned.
Oh, yeah.
Then they moved to Vermont. Of all
Goodness
things,
gracious,
in
yes.
northern Vermont. But it's really interesting. I mean, I think I had a fascinating. My grandmother started a school in Harlem for a business school for African Americans when she was fired from a Jewish-owned business school that didn't that wouldn't admit African Americans to daytime classes. They would to the nighttime classes, but not to the daytime classes. And she was fired at the beginning of the Depression, basically, because she made a fuss about that. my grandparents were both my grandparents and my parents were union organizers in their spare time, and stuff. So I come from that kind of a background, and but it's still true that I'm white, and
Oh, yeah.
it doesn't.
Absolutely.
I grew up. I grew up with a lot of African American aunties, and I have to tell you that I'm totally more afraid of large white Southern men than I am of any African American man, as far as I'm concerned. The African American men are dear people. So it's how you grow up, but that's that's not that doesn't change anything of the privilege that I've had.
And it's hard too for people. I have friends who grew up like many that talked about it in all white, really saw no African Americans or people of any color until maybe in their 20s. And that upbringing is I mean, that's foreign to me growing up in Virginia. I mean, we were there were 3 high schools all there, and we all split Gum Springs, which was the black neighborhood. We all split it up so we could meet our numbers, and so we at least had exposure, and we were on teams together, and
it
but
makes
even
a big
so,
difference.
it helps, but it's still not there. Jason, I talked to him one day. I said, don't you think things are getting better?
Yeah.
And he said to me, he looked at me and he said, I was in 3rd grade the first time I was called the N-word. I was 3rd grade. He said, my daughter came home last year having been called the N-word. She's in 1st grade.
God.
And
Gosh.
when you hear stories like that, you go, no, it's not gotten better. It's
No, it's not gotten better. No, it really hasn't. And you know, and actually being Jewish, it feels much scarier now than it did when, you know, I mean, the anti-Semitism is much more open now than it was when I was growing up. It sort of seemed like, you know, that wasn't ever going to be a problem again, you know, so that people learned their lesson worldwide, but it didn't work, did it? You know, it's sort of like you know, so I just, you know, Terry is exactly the same age as I, and he grew up in Dallas, in Irving, Texas, and he never experienced integration in the schools. Always because he was just above the stair step integration. So his brothers had some experience of that in the same schools, but he never experienced it. He was, however, grow up in a liberal family, and so he got involved in CORE when he was in high school, so Congress of Racial Equality. So he had some exposure, but you know, I grew up in a culturally Jewish family, not you know, my great grandparents were religious, but my grandparents weren't. And I grew up, my religious background is mostly in the African American church, because we didn't ever do any religion, except my grandmother used to take me to church when people got married, or you know, mostly when people got married. So she would get invited to the weddings of all these young women. So, and she'd take me with her. So anyway, so it's a kind of an odd, and that music is the music that I grew up with, although I also grew up with classical music and international music. But anyhow, it's fascinating, you know, and on the other hand, we need to get beyond what we grew up with. But I think it's more pain. I mean, for somebody who grew up in an all-white community, it's more difficult. It really is more
you don't
difficult.
see it. That's right. You don't experience it. You haven't, you know, you may have experienced that time or two where you were outcast from a group in school, or for some reason you were called out and embarrassed. But what you don't have is you know, I mean, you can't change the color of your skin, and
Well, I grew up fat, so you know I got a lot of flack around that, you know. But it isn't the same. I got the flack where you could change it if you wanted to, but that didn't happen to me. So until very recently. So
well, I mean, that's the whole thing with the chattel slavery that just is amazing, because of the color of your skin. Therefore, you were less than a human, and
I know.
how we could get there,
I
and we
know.
did, and the problem, you know, I mean, I could talk this all day, but I think I don't know that racism by itself is the worst issue or the biggest issue we have to face, but certainly the hate that is involved in racism, that sentiment,
and the violence that it's the use of guns and violence to express that, to protect one group as opposed to another. So it's insidious in our society. It eats at us, and it's the reason why it's part of the reason why we have this disaster that we just had, because people, you know, because of greed and hate.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah. Well, anyhow, but you know, I also think that there's some hope. The hardest time for me was when my African American friends pulled away from me in my, you know, just about my college years, because they didn't want to have to do with, you know, white people anymore. The you know, it was hard for me to understand. I don't think I really understood it at that point at all. I do now, so why they did that.
Yeah.
And it's sort of, and I understand what they were suffering from the point of view of I could go anywhere. I mean, I ended up going to college in Wisconsin, and there were almost no African Americans at Beloit College, and even at the University of Wisconsin, the very few African American students when I was up there working for AFSC. Right. And one of my African American friends came out to visit with me, and I didn't understand how uncomfortable she was. She must have been incredibly uncomfortable and incredibly scared. Yeah. So it's really interesting.
Yeah, it's amazing.
So it is changing somewhat, because this generation that's coming up mostly was raised in a society where there were people of color, in their schools and in their, my grandkids, for instance, well, and that makes a difference.
It's true in some areas, but it's not true in all. My daughter lives out in Portland, Oregon.
Yeah.
And it is that is a very, very white community.
Lived there for 2 years.
Yes.
Yeah.
And she says, a lot of her friends who have lived there, I mean, a lot, it's a migratory town, as you know, but a lot of the people that were born and lived there, they didn't go to school with very few African American kids, just because of the nature of it. And Oregon, as liberal as it is, has a horrible history.
Oh God! It's horrible. Yeah, Portland itself has a horrible history. Anyway, Anyway, thank you. This was really good. Thanks for doing it. Yeah. We'll see you next week, I guess. And you're missing the music here, but okay. I can hear it in the other room. Yeah, I'm sure you get plenty. I enjoy your music immensely.
Oh, well, thank you. Thank you very much.
Thanks a
it's
lot.
A lifesaver. All right.
Yeah,
Liz.
It is. Take care.
Take care.
Bye-bye, Chip.
Bye-bye.